I'm Linda Baker, the Learning Director at the Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children. I'm located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Lenapeewuk, and the Attawandaron peoples. These lands are connected with the London Township and Sombra Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. Please think about the traditional lands you are currently situated on and join us in acknowledging and thanking the generations of Indigenous peoples who have cared for these lands and in celebrating the continued strength and spirit of Indigenous peoples. The ongoing work to make the promise of truth and reconciliation real in our communities and to bring justice for missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people across the country should inform our discussions in this resource spotlight and beyond. It is International Women's Day, a time to recognize and celebrate the achievements of all who identify as women and to recommit ourselves to continuing to work to establish gender equality in our homes, schools, workplaces, and communities. On behalf of the Learning Network team, I would like to welcome everyone to our resource spotlight. Today, the spotlight is shining on a presentation and discussion with the authors of a recently released guest editorial for the Learning Network entitled Building the Table, discussing tensions of 2SLGBTQIA+ structural inclusion within the gender-based violence sector. I'm so pleased to introduce the authors who are with us today, and I'm going to introduce them in alphabetical order by their surnames. Jade Byard Peak is a young Afro-Lanu trans woman, artist, educator, and community advocate originally from Halifax, Nova Scotia. She is the Director of Operations at Kindspace, a 2SLGBTQIA+ center in Ottawa, and an associate with Wisdom to Action. Marlene Ham works as the Executive Director at the Ontario Association of Interval and Transition Houses and is a member of the 2SLGBTQ+ community. Marlene has worked in a variety of social justice and social service organizations and has co-authored publications on queer issues. Debbie Owusu-Akyeeah is an award-winning Black feminist with over 8 years of local and international advocacy experience through feminist initiatives in the Ottawa-Gatineau region and through working at Oxfam Canada and Global Affairs Canada. She is the Executive Director at the Canadian Centre for Gender and Sexual Diversity. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to our three presenters and discussants.
Hi, everyone. Marlene here. Thank you. I want to thank the Learning Network for the opportunity and for bringing myself and Jade and Debbie together. And it's really been a great honor to get to know both Debbie and Jade over the past number of months as we work together to build our table, to put together this editorial. And we'll talk a little bit more about how we built our table a little later on. I would like to start off by acknowledging the traditional territory where I work and live of the Anishinaabe people, which includes Odawa, Ojibwe, and the Potawatomi Nations, also known as the Three Fire Confederacy. So I'm a little bit outside of Toronto, north of Toronto, and so that is where I am. I'd like to wish everyone a happy International Women's Day, and how appreciative we are to be here. Before I begin, I thought I'd acknowledge, we've talked about in our editorial or through our views, our own social locations and our own experience and knowledge. And we certainly appreciate that some of what you've read in the editorial may not be new, but we hope that it inspires change and transformation in our collective work together as we turn our focus to discussing some real structural tensions that are embedded in GBV services. So I'm just going to move this over here. So this is a bit of an overview, and we are gonna sort of discuss together between Jade, Debbie, and I as we kind of move through this. You know, we're at the table, and so we're gonna kind of move through this in that way. But just to give you a brief overview, we're gonna look at some of those historical and contemporary tensions that we talked about and how this really frames our discussion. Looking at some recommendations and advocacy around what is needed to support 2S LGBTQ plus communities and people who are accessing services, and then finally exploring how we build that table together and engage in relationship building cross-sectorally. So to sort of frame this a little bit, in our editorial, we talk a lot about you know, that binary, like gender binary, or you know, dichotomous thinking. So, you know, as we sort of move through this, we thought about some other practices that have been developed over time to deal with other complex social issues. So these are just kind of a few. I mean, you know, some ways binary thinking is kind of this way or that way, but we know that there's been other practices that have been created to deal with another way. And so, you know, some of those have been intersectionality, harm reduction practices, looking at, you know, safer sex practices. Rapid testing could possibly be a more recent one that some of us are familiar with. And, you know, in the context of shelter programs, you know, there was a time when to seek service, people had to leave and go into shelter, but a lot has changed around shelter programs. And they're definitely, as Women's Shelters Canada has coined, definitely more than a shelter. So there's many different programs that survivors and their children can access at different parts within their experience. So just a few examples to kind of, you know, shape our thinking when we're looking at working with 2S LGBTQ communities to move us out of that binary way of thinking about gender. Okay, so I'm going to pass it on to Debbie, and she's going to walk us through framing our discussion here on historical context.
Thank you so much, Marlene, and thank you to everyone who's joining us today. Not overwhelming at all to see the number of you folks who are in attendance. I think it's amazing, and really excited to have this conversation with you all, with my two colleagues here. So to introduce myself, my name is Debbie. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm joining you all from the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people, also known as Ottawa. So here in the nation's capital, where I guess we get to feel and see things around funding, the gender justice movement, the 2S LGBTQ sector, kind of differently here in proximity to federal decision making. And so that kind of frames a little bit of the context I'm bringing here, especially as a former public servant, but then also as someone who's been engaging in feminist activism here in the Ottawa community since I moved here about 12 years ago. But then also as someone who was involved more directly with a second stage women's shelter as a board chair up until June of 2021. So I've often been someone who's an advocate of saying that boards of directors play a significant role in kind of informing organizational change in the gender-based violence sector, and to not forget about that. And so excited to bring that perspective. When we were kind of discussing our editorial, I don't know if it's because I'm just like a nerd for history, but I really felt it was important for us to kind of contextualize the feminist history of the gender-based violence sector in Canada, because I don't think it's one that we get to talk about a lot in the context of the actual sector. Of course, we're so familiar about talking about feminism, especially in the Canadian context, in waves, but it's those pockets of history, the pockets of like funding, the pockets of the establishment of shelters to begin with, that I don't think we've ever done too much of a deep dive in. And I felt it was important to contextualize that, because there's a beautiful quote I found on Twitter that history is a great teacher of context. And I think if we're going to understand some of the current tensions we have today, we need to understand where did some of these things start and what do they mean and what can we learn from that. So I started here with the second wave of feminism that we usually kind of place around the 60s and 70s, because that kind of marked a very significant change in how women's issues in Canada were being discussed, specifically in the context of the federal government and the state apparatus as a whole. Here on this slide here, I specifically mention, the concept of the personal is political, because at this time, issues around domestic violence, issues around gender-based violence were kind of seen within like the public sphere, or something we didn't talk about publicly, or something that was not supposed to be a concern of, again, state institutions, like of course the government on the federal side, provincially, also including other institutions like policing, for example. And what feminists did in kind of mainstreaming the personal as political, they really ruptured that, again, binary, or that duality between the public sphere and the private sphere, and recognizing that these issues, including violence that we've regulated to being private and therefore not worth discussing, not worth having policy interventions for, is incorrect, considering the magnitude and the impact it has on societies as a whole. And in my personal opinion, that phrase has marked a very pivotal moment in us shifting the way we talk about issues that impact us at the individual level, and what they really mean in the context of like power across all institutions. So around this time, we were seeing kind of women's organizing and like that collective solidarity movements and building happening with the establishment of certain organizations like the National Action Committee on the Status of Women, which established in 1972. Why this marked a particular shift on top of what was happening with regards to the grassroots movements around gender-based violence is that it marked the creation of institutions that the federal government was formally engaging with on women's issues, including domestic violence. This meant, as in a way, feminist activists had an ear of the government in a way to kind of explain these issues, again, disrupts this binary around the public and the private sphere, and really inform what was going to be, of course, pivotal changes in policy and funding for the sector as a whole. And so I mentioned here specifically Pierre Elliott Trudeau. The last name might sound familiar for a reason. It was during this time, during his prime ministerialship, if that's a word, where due to the influencing of the NAC, we were able to see the establishment of two of the first of their kind programming that enabled activists to create shelters for women fleeing violence. So this was the first time we were actually seeing federal funding being put in the hands of activists to essentially take what we were fighting for on the ground and to create something that was going to be instrumental for a significant portion of our population who was fleeing violence. I shared this photo here. I found it in a news article, and if I'm correct, I think this is from Toronto Interval House, but I share it because at this moment, we see the first ever women's shelters across Canada open up. We saw them in Toronto, we saw them in Vancouver, we saw them popping up around the country. And it was because of feminist activists at this time, shifting public opinion, forcing federal governments to listen to us, and then to also shift funding to the issues that mattered, that we see this establishment happening, which now brings us to, of course, what we have today. However, when we talk about, of course, the feminist activism that was happening at the time, that was, of course, shifting public opinion around domestic violence and whose concerns were being heard and really mattered. We were still seeing what many of us continue to fight against today, the centering and the experiences of certain women when it comes to power, even within the gender-based violence sector. I shared this particular quote here from Nora Loretto: "Feminism that doesn't challenge the status quo cannot successfully dismantle patriarchy." And it came from her book, which I have right next to me, and it's called Take Back the Fight: Organizing Feminism for the Digital Age. And I highly encourage those who are interested in the Canadian feminist history to take a look at it. This book was actually instrumental in me finding information around what was happening in the 70s with the NAC, with the gender-based violence sector, with funding. This quote, I think, is important because what we were seeing at the time, and which we continue to see today, was a status quo being shifted for some. And as we continue to move on in history through the third wave or the fourth wave that we're in today, we continuously see women who were not included in those original conversations around domestic violence, around feminism, the ones whose movements have been instrumental, by the way, in kind of giving us access to the language we have now, kind of being shut from those mainstream discourses on the gender-based violence sector. And so I specifically included in this slide here a quote from our editorial that says the following: "It is because of the work of Indigenous women, Black women, poor women, disabled women, queer and trans women that feminist activists have developed insight into structural forms of violence and systemic barriers to accessing services or addressing violence in their lives. Despite this, the shelter movement still struggles to accommodate 2SLGBTQ+ people, and more specifically, transgender people." In developing this section, I really had to search hard to find research that really explored what else was happening as the feminist movement was evolving from the 70s to the 80s into the 90s. And I was fortunate enough to find some literature that specifically spoke to the fact that, all of these other women who were struggling for systemic inclusion and were constantly trying to bring attention to the diversity of experiences and those systemic barriers, about specifically 2SLGBTQ people's inclusion and transgender folks. And in it, we see that same theme of, the shelter movement was able to get it somewhat with regards to everyone else. So I think specifically about Black feminist activists, working class activists, feminist activists who've been instrumental in kind of shifting the conversation, especially around the 80s. What we see as being that pattern is that specifically transgender inclusion continues to be confronted within the sector based off, binary thinking that still exists within our feminist movements. And I think it's important to acknowledge, and I speak from the perspective as a cisgender queer woman, that although we are well equipped to talk about how systemic oppression and the patriarchy impacts us, we do not do a good job, or we're still working on it, about how we also replicate that similar form of violence and marginalization within our own communities as women and gender diverse folks. And so in the editorial, in this section, I really try my best to kind of frame in not that many pages. And so maybe one day this might explore into something bigger, but really kind of drawing the connection between how this shelter movement that changed the lives of many of us. Trust me, it changed my life. It's what brought me into feminism to begin with, is the shelter movement. But how there's still so much work to be done and that we can learn from history. And this kind of brings us to a section at the end of the historical part of the editorial, which I think has inspired a lot of conversation for myself, Jade, and Marlene. And this is around the archetype. I specifically found I think it was a PhD dissertation, and I think it's sourced in the editorial. If not, I'll gladly share with you where I found it. It was from a PhD candidate over at the University of Ottawa, who again did a deep dive on the gender-based violence feminist history in Canada. During the second wave to third wave, when we were seeing that funding happening for the first time, that funding didn't last forever, folks. And I think for any of us who work in social services, we all know how precarious the funding is, how often sometimes we're dependent on who's in political power at the time. Are they willing to listen to us? But then also our kind of creative feminist activism to be advocates to really paint the picture of the need in order for us to see the funding to accompany it. And basically what feminist activists at the time did, again, trying to shift public opinion, and especially at a time where that project funding was either ending or was shifting in a way, was that they felt the need to really continue the conversation to get the public on board on how violence manifests in our communities, how they manifest in our home, and what impact they have on us as people navigating the Canadian society as a whole. Thus, the archetype that we see get established and developed, which we've talked about having still a significant impact on how we understand violence and how it manifests in a gender context. So when we talk about the archetype, we're talking about the kind of image that has been created in our head about who is a victim of gender-based violence and who's a perpetrator of it. And here we specifically talk about the helpless, battered woman and the abusive man who seeks to control his wife. That archetype was super, super powerful for a variety of reasons, because people understood that through a very specific understanding of gender and power. When we think about the 70s, when we think about the 60s, it was not hard for people to really imagine a man who might have power specifically around finances in his home, physical stature over his wife, etc. And then also the power that women were continuing to fight to seek for, but we continue to see not really manifested within the context of a very heterosexual relationship. And basically what that did is that it kind of created a permanent etch in our minds, even now until 2022, of intimate partner violence being solely seen as this binary situation that is very, very heterosexual, very, very cisgender, and it does not allow for other room of understanding gender-based violence beyond that archetype. What also happens specifically is it doesn't include how homophobic or transphobic violence, both that I think all three of us would argue are gender-based violences in themselves, manifest, which then creates these structural marginalizations outside of the gender-based violence sector when the sector depended on that archetype for legitimacy, for funding, and for, I would say, political power when it comes to advocating for, again, policy interventions to improve the lives of women, but then other gender diverse people in our society. So that's it with regards to the historical section and the archetype. But I think we're all going to have a broader conversation about the different types of violences outside of that archetype and what they mean. And so I'll actually throw it to Jade to introduce herself, and we can go right into this section.
Yes, Kwe Teriak Jade Peak, Adelsi Jade Peak, Delewik Jabuktuk Migmagi Wabanagi. Hi, folks. I would like to first start off by thanking, again, the Learning Network for inviting the three of us to sort of discuss these issues specifically within the GBV sector and some of these structural issues that exist. But I sort of, as in lieu of International Women's Day, I just want to give a few shout outs. Specifically, every year I think about women who lead and consistently carry the voices and sort of the struggle for not only just women's liberation, but liberation for 2SLGBT folks and looking at sort of how those collaborations exist within our sector. Today I want to honor some Black women. They include Neka McGregor, Angela McDougall, Sarah Jama, Marlene Lopez, Dr. Tope Adafara Khan, and of course, Debbie and other Black women who continue to lead in this sector as well. And so when we look outside of the archetype, it's really important that we're not saying that this archetype doesn't exist. but that violence occurs and exists outside of that, including within same-sex relationships, including within trans relationships, and looking at sort of how 2SLGBT folks haven't necessarily been included in that process. Today, as we sort of move forward and talking about outside of the archetype, we talk about building the table and we sort of go into some tensions. There might be some triggering conversations that happen. We'll make a note that conversations might be triggering. And when those conversation ends, I'll be putting a finger on my nose to let you know that I'm done talking about something that might be triggering, including an example of sexual assault that might be used as a framing of sort of around violence. So I want to discuss sort of how violence is viewed, specifically internal, interpersonal, cultural, institutional, and systemic. Now we sort of know how each one, sort of those internal oppressions, those interpersonal connections between two people, cultural in our own societies and our own communities, how institutions, how violence permeates through that, and as well as through systemic violence, how all these things are interconnected. And when we focus particularly on the archetype, those experiences are erased. And when we talk about addressing it, we sort of talked about the scarcity of funding. And that sort of exists right now to this day, and we're going to talk about it. But one thing we want to sort of note as it is International Women's Day, and we're talking about experiences of intersectional women, including trans women, but also gender diverse folks, is that one of the main pieces that we're talking about is, as well as the inclusion and cross-sectoral communication between different organizations and sectors, including 2SLGBT orgs. And we want to sort of move past this notion that the work has to be done in silos, or that we can't lift each other up, as well as the fact that, you know, even in scarcity, 2SLGBT organizations like Kindspace have had to sort of fit and try to scrounge resources in order to address GBV issues, not only within our own communities, but also how sort of 2SLGBT, either through marketing, either through representation, either through own structures, prevent 2SLGBT folks from accessing shelters, especially trans women. And so I sort of wanted to address that as an introduction in sort of some of the things that we might be talking about as we continue to move forward. But we recognize that violence is disproportionately affected by Indigenous, Black, racialized, women living with disabilities, poor women, and older women, and that colonialism is a root to all of those things. Looking at femicide data, particularly around intimate partner violence or relation to a family member. We know that intimate partner violence is a huge overrepresentation of violence within gender-based violence. But we also know that this archetype reinforces that, man beats wife, but that violence can also exist through family, through non-romantic relationships, fathers, brothers, other sorts of folks in the community, and that gender-based violence is also expanded just beyond just related to violence against women, but as well as transphobia, homophobia, and we'll be sort of looking into those statistics of how sort of they disproportionately affect, but also engage even within our own sector, and how if we only focus on one archetype, or we only focus on one form of violence, the type of inclusion that we've sort of been trying to fight for over the last decade or so is not really going to work out. And so we have to move beyond the binary framing around violence. And this does not mean the erasure of women. And I think this is one of the hardest sticking points is that inclusion means that, and we'll talk about more about it as we get there, that inclusion immediately means the erasure of women experiences, specifically cis women experiences, which does not occur when we talk about inclusion or we talk about structural changes in order to prevent gender-based violence in all of our societies and how it manifests. And so that is a critical piece, I think, when we're talking about scarcity in terms of funding in order to increase or capacity in terms of being able to adequately address some of the mission statements. We know that as the decade has moved forward since 2010s, many organizations, many traditionally VAW orgs have sort of adjusted in order to include trans folks in various of ways. And so as we sort of move forward in this conversation, I think it is important that we recognize that those changes, or as we talk about this archetype, it's not a point of erasure, but a point of zooming into the nuance of violence and how we best can mitigate it and address it, both either just within the gender-based violence sector, but as well as shelters, as we discussed today. I don't know, maybe I'll pass it on to Marlene to add a little bit more into expanding outside of this archetype.
Great, thank you so much, Jade. And you know, for OATH and our organization, you know, one of the areas that I've been able to kind of see where that archetype has really sort of been upheld would be around OATH's work around femicide tracking, and so they started to do that in 1995. And they were looking specifically at intimate partner femicides. So that's why we've included a couple of these graphs here. So just for context, these graphs are from last year's femicides only in Ontario. So, so just for that context, so that people understand. And a few years ago, we started to look at femicides kind of in four main categories, which really, you know, it does look outside the archetype, because we are looking at intimate partner violence, but we're also looking at family relationships, known relationships. Sometimes the media will report that they were known to one another, but they won't necessarily say how. And then sometimes it's unknown. And I'm not going to go into any of the, you know, the details necessarily about these femicides, but it is an example of, you know, when we expand our understanding of the archetype, we start to see, we definitely start to see how gender-based violence really does exist outside of intimate partner violence and within many different types of relationships. And the family relationships are continuing to increase each year in our femicide tracking, where we are tracking more and more femicides in that category. And the other piece that we found really interesting, and we've been trying to get a better sense of this over the past few years, but it is dependent on media reporting. And this last year, we were able to have, I believe it was 78% of media articles in Ontario that were reporting on femicides had also included race and ethnicity. So with that data set that we have, we were able to learn that 36% of all femicide victims are from visible minority populations. So in particular, Indigenous, Black, and racialized communities. So, so it is something that, you know, when we look back to the disproportionality of violence for these communities, we probably wouldn't have been able to do this if we hadn't changed our frame a bit. So it required us to change the way we framed femicides, our definitions around femicide, and really expanding our scope and our lens. And by doing that, you know, we've also learned that there is disproportionality, you know, ending up in all of these types of femicides. So, so it has been a structural change, and, you know, so this kind of brings us back to some of those structural tensions. If, you know, if we can't make some of those changes, then we're not going to have the information or the data to understand this issue. So that, you know, as an example for folks here participating, that was a structural change that had to occur in order for us to get a different understanding of femicides across Ontario. And Debbie, is there anything you want to contribute here at all?
Yeah, and I think I'll switch the slide just because I feel like it'll help with framing a little bit more of the context about why looking outside of the archetype is important when we're looking at like the inclusion of 2SLGBTQ people with regarding the GBV shelter movement. Here we have a few statistics from a survey of safety in public and private spaces. Now, this data comes from 2018, and of course, we are fortunate enough that many 2SLGBTQ organizations nationally and locally have been doing their own community-based research that has given us a little bit more frequent data that we are kind of happy now to know that this is being heard by decision makers, still waiting to see some shifts, but having this data is more important than anything. And I just think it's important for us to kind of look at some of these. For example, sexual minority Canadians were also more likely than heterosexual Canadians to report experiencing inappropriate behaviors in public. So there's some stats there. In the 12 months preceding the survey, another one in particular that I think is important to highlight is the one that speaks to transgender Canadians who are more likely to have experienced violence since age 15, and also more likely to experience inappropriate behaviors in public, online, and at work more than cisgender Canadians. This is obviously just a very small snapshot of what some 2SLGBTQ people have to experience. But what I think it really drives the message home, and Jade spoke to this early, is that the archetype, although very, very useful, and we've seen this when it comes to some of the shifts and the changes that it has afforded us as activists, when we see what's left out of that archetype, we see that we aren't having concrete conversations about what is our shelter's response to these violences that exist for 2SLGBTQ people. In my work at the Canadian Centre for Gender and Sexual Diversity, and I speak to this again as a queer woman who is a feminist, I'm often talking to policymakers at the federal level about the need to look beyond the need to look beyond gender-based violence as being violence that impacts cisgender women and girls, because we need to see homophobia, transphobia, and biphobia. And I want to say thank you to the person who mentioned that in the chat. We often don't talk about biphobia and the specific violence that is inflicted on bisexual women in particular, and then bisexual men who oftentimes don't even feel comfortable enough to come out as a result of stigma and stereotypes. But homophobia and transphobia are gender-based violences in themselves because they are a response to people not performing the gender that they were assigned to at birth. Specifically, the expectation on who you are supposed to have intimate and romantic and sexual partnerships with. So when I talk about things like corrective rape, for example, that bisexual women, lesbian, queer women, specifically butch lesbian women, and we don't talk about that often with masculine presenting women and the violence that is inflicted on them. It's supposed to be a gender corrective type of violence. And we need to understand that as being something that exists in our societies that are worthy of a response from a funding level, from an inclusionary level. And I think the survey results that we have here kind of speak to that, but the anecdotal evidence, I think, not only all three of us through the work that we do, but I think so many of you who are coming from shelters across the country, you've heard this before. And so it requires that kind of shift in our understanding of how violence manifests itself, and that it is also intimate, and that it is also public, and that same conversation needs to take place if we really want to have a robust movement that is going to essentially address patriarchy as a whole. So yeah, I'll pass it back to you, Marlene, for the next section.
Yeah, and just kind of building on that slide, you know, we have more information here. I don't think we'll sort of delve too deep. I mean, I think you know, in here, it really shows the differences between both male and female gender identified against sexual minority and those who identify as heterosexual. So, so I think that, to build on what Debbie talked about, I don't think that, we have research and we're always having to, legitimize, and we're going to kind of get into, that a little bit. But, these experiences are real. These experiences are valid. And so I'm just going to sort of flip over, and so we can talk a little bit more about how these contemporary tensions and gaps, really intersect with one another, but they're informed by that archetype. And we see that through legislation, through funding, through how we deliver services and the research. So, and, those past two slides that we shared with you, that's all fairly recent. And so we're just kind of in this space of really trying to look at how, with that data, what does that then mean for the work that we do in gender-based violence services? It is helping us to kind of understand that that archetype may not fit for all communities, and I think we've kind of learned that over time. So when we look, I jumped ahead. So when we look at legislation, just a couple of notes here. For the 2SLGBTQ communities, legislation really has, in some ways, consumed our lives, and without it, we needed it to become legitimate. Shouldn't be the way, but that's the truth. And so we, there's three pieces of legislation that we talked about as a group. The first one was in Ontario, so that's known as Toby's Act, and that was the first legislation of its kind in North America. I don't know if similar legislation had existed prior to that outside of North America or not. But this is the piece of legislation that I started to identify gender identity and gender expression. And then more recently, there was Bill C-16, which many of you are probably much more familiar with. And then very recently would be the amendment to the criminal code to end conversion therapy. And these are very difficult. I mean, it's difficult to have this conversation, that these kinds of legislation, this type of legislation, has really been there to legitimize queer people and queer bodies, really, in a lot of ways. And so we kind of, as we sort of move through some of this discussion between the three of us, we've pulled in a couple of quotes from our editorial. So the first one, digging deeper into the challenges of sexual and gender diverse inclusion in domestic violence shelters specifically, because that's a lot of what we had talked about. They have differences in assessing gender between requiring autonomous self-identification, which actually comes through the MCCSS shelter standards here in Ontario. So, women are able to self-identify. It's a much more sort of autonomous model. To then more invasive and harmful practices that assess gender based on medical procedures, legal names, and sex assigned at birth. So the piece here to think about is, for your organizations, are you assessing gender differently for those who identify as transgender, gender diverse, than those who may identify or present as your understanding as cisgender women coming into the shelter. So, you know, obviously for us, we would deem and have deemed assessing gender in those ways as harmful practices. But they're real and they do happen, and that is a piece of the structural tension that occurs. The other piece we talked about here is these examples of situating 2SLGBTQIA individuals into a service delivery model that is predicated on the gender binary, sex segregation, and heteronormative family structures fails to recognize the larger continuum of marginalized gender identities. And for us, that was really, as we sort of drilled down, that was really the difference between inclusion into our model or actually transforming it. So, you know, that was kind of the defining difference. So, you know, this is sort of where, you know, we kind of looked at, you know, some of these complexities and nuances and some of those structural, you know, one of those structural tensions as it relates to legislation. So I'm going to call in Jade and Debbie to see if there's any, you know, anything else you want to sort of add to kind of what we had talked about when we were speaking of legislation.
I don't know if Jade wants to go first, but yeah, for me, when it came to the legislation conversation, I think in this part, you know, I think we were kind of just like trying to go back to the conversations we had. We kind of talked about, of course, these like 3 points that we have here, especially the most recent one, and like what does it mean now? And I think of the conversion therapy one in particular, now that we have it entrenched in our criminal code, and it's just like, what does that then mean now from a gender-based violence sector response to even looking at that as a form of violence, and how are we best equipped to respond to that as folks who are working within the GBV shelter sector as a whole. And I kind of just see immediately the need for that collaboration cross-sectorally on how better to respond to that and to the needs of survivors who are coming in because of they going through that particular process. But yeah, that's about it for me in terms of the conversation on legislation. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think we'll be looping back into this a little bit later, but also the cultural tension of this. You know, many of the, specifically Bill C-16, Bill C-4, these were very controversial bills. You know, specifically in, you know, outside just more in the general feminist discourse, within the, you know, the 2SLGBT discourse. You know, there was a lot of resistance to, you know, having 2SLGBT folks, regardless of gender identity, being sort of enshrined and protected in Canada. And so, you know, and it's also very interesting because, you know, again, this has come within sort of the last 10, 20 years of sort of this movement in order to, you know, have this legislation. But again, this informs, you know, being able to research, being able to access more funding, being able to sort of access these other tensions and gaps that without legislation, without sort of that anchor, you know, our identities are not validated or recognized, and you know, both institutionally, both outside of those institutions, but as well inside. And so these are legislation has been very key, and I think very important as we move forward. And I think, again, we'll be talking about this, but it has only been a short period of time. You know, it is 2022. This legislation has been in for short periods of time. We've been adjusting. And so that is so important as we move forward in this conversation of how we've been adjusting to these legislative changes. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Dave. And then, you know, when we look at, I jumped ahead again. Okay, structural implications in research. We did have some discussion around this. We have shown you a couple of slides, but some of our discussion was looking at statistical standards, and you know, we talked a little bit around some recent changes how definitions of sex and gender have evolved, have changed, how we have different understandings. And, of a lot of the research that is out there that speaks to the community, a lot of that can be really focused around mental health framing. And certainly there has been an impact for our communities related to trans misogyny, related to homophobia, to biphobia on mental health and mental wellness, on health outcomes. So there are reasons why that has happened, for sure. But we also, understand it needs to kind of go beyond that scope as well. So we included a quote in here from Glenda McNaughton that was in the editorial, a consensus that rests on authoritative and officially sanctioned truths always silences alternative truths, marginalizes diversity, and reduces it to abnormality. So, we felt that this was a good fit in terms of this process of what happens when truths become authoritative and, essentially they become officially sanctioned. And that really puts 2SLGBTQ communities on the periphery, and on the outside, and really stops that ability for structural change and true system change. So this leads to structurally designed legislation and funding and service delivery that's really informed through a cisgender and heteronormative framing of violence. So yeah, Debbie, Jade, anything you want to weigh in on here?
Yeah, specifically on research, and again, I keep saying we're going to keep talking about it, is again, that research is so critical. We know that research into trans individuals has been stalled and has lagged behind. We've seen the work of Trans Pulse and other, researchers who've been trying to sort of meet that gap and sort of addressing trans, non-binary, and two-spirit identities and experiences of violence, specifically around gender-based violence. And one of the impacts of sort of and lack of research is also how we've sort of been addressing sort of the progress that we've made in terms of organizations and GBV organizations and services that have sort of, made ambitious efforts to include either through, going through consulting or going through internal changes or policy changes, and sort of addressing how to sort of accommodate both transgender and two-spirit and non-binary folks, and also sexually and gender diverse folks within their missions. And so one thing we've realized is there's sort of like this lack of not so much reporting, but how is it working? What are the challenges? What are the issues that we're running into, and is it working? And also, again, looking at sort of there has been some research in terms of independently of retention and who is accessing services. But more work needs to be done to sort of address both how violence is being perceived and sort of, we looked at the specifically in terms of the the survey specifically on public and private spaces in 2018. And that really allowed for both Statistics Canada to actually define gender identity and actually look for that in terms when researching. And I think that's important in terms of all research, specifically those in GBV, especially when you're doing your own needs assessments, in including spaces for trans and gender diverse and non-binary folks to access and to be included within that research. Because again, without that inclusion, without that existence within research, then those narratives, those stories, and those experiences are silenced, and then there is no work that can be done upon it. And so want to really look at specifically, again, that piece, but also, again, as we talk about sort of having a standard or looking at how we evaluate, researching into how we evaluate and how we, how we track our progress, especially as we move forward in inclusive mandates and missions.
Great. Thanks, Jade. And okay, so funding. I think this is the exciting part.
It is. Boy, do I love talking about funding.
Yeah.
So funny how your view on funding changes when you become an executive director. So I remember when we were first having this conversation about what this editorial could look like. And one of my first things I went to is we need to talk about gaps in funding, because it's a reality I think everyone in the nonprofit sector understands really intimately. But I think for the 2SLGBTQ sector, we really understand the gaps with regards to funding, or the lack thereof in particular for our sector, because there has been a history of systemically underfunding LGBTQ initiatives, programs across the board. And I think where the conversation has been starting to shift, and there's just something about, and I would actually say like around, since the pandemic has started, and I think in the last 2 years, the national 2SLGBTQ movement, and I would say that in relation to our organizations, it feels like we're the most, cohesive we've ever been in a very long time, where we're having coordinated conversations about these gaps and then working collectively to address them through advocacy, through, I would say, public campaigning, et cetera. I'm going to talk about the Enchante Network very shortly. And for those who haven't heard of who they are, the Enchante Network is a national network of 2SLGBTQ organizations from coast to coast to coast. They have about 200 members as part of their network. And these are all LGBTQ organizations from the national level, provincial to local. And they've been instrumental in helping galvanize some of the conversations we're having within the 2SLGBTQ space around funding, but then also some of the gaps we're seeing when it comes to the gender-based violence part. And so I'll get to that. I think what's been the most interesting thing about the funding is that we haven't ever, as a movement yet, gotten to a point where like core funding is something that's accessible to us. And I mentioned this, and of course, I'm going to be making some comparisons to the GBV sector, and this is not as a way to undermine what has been fought for funding for the GBV shelter, recognizing that still, again, governments kind of force scarcity upon us. They force us to compete against each other. And I think they also manufacture that same scarcity and competition, even cross-sectorally. And so much of our work, I wouldn't say overlaps, I would just say reinforces, what our mandates are fighting for. There's been a conversation that we've been having about what would it look like, say here in the province of Ontario, if LGBT organizations were able to access core funding from the province that we've seen come out of, and I will always butcher the acronym, is it MCCSS? Marlene, help me here. Is that it? Perfect, thank you. What would it look like if we were able to access something similar without obviously taking away from what is obviously needed for other sectors? What LGBTQ organizations have had to do over the last few decades is be really, really creative with very little. And I think Jade is nodding her head because she knows this intimately as someone who works for a local LGBTQ shelter, or if not shelter, sorry, Freudian slip, and I'll get to why I said that, as a center. And it's because the needs of what our organizations have been doing almost expand beyond our mandates as a result of our communities not being able to feel included or feel like they can even access some of those like traditional emergency crisis supports. So prime example, and I'm going to use Kindspace if that's okay, Jade. Kindspace is not a crisis shelter at all. It's a community center that is meant to connect LGBTQ people with each other through programming. And I would say, just like many other LGBTQ organizations have been across the country, they're almost like the lifeline of our community. They're a space in where we gather. They are a space where we can connect, mobilize, and organize. But they have also transformed to being a space where 2SLGBTQ people feel safe enough to come to when they've experienced violence, when they've been kicked out of their house because of violence that's happening, also interpersonally, but with parents, for example, or even with partners. But an organization like Kindspace does not have the infrastructure or the funding to be able to accommodate that particular need that's coming from community. And what's also being confronted at the same time is obviously a history that we have to acknowledge, that our community members not feeling safe enough to access traditional means of GBV emergency support. And that's just the reality of the history that we've been talking about, and obviously something that we need to continuously fight to change while we fight for, funding to support what our organizations have almost been pushed to do. We are forced to be really creative with project funding. I'll speak to my organization as an example. We do education-related work across the country in schools and with youth from coast to coast to coast. But we're often applying every year for the same pot of funding from like Heritage Canada, which doesn't have a specific LGBTQ focus, but we're able to kind of squeeze our way in through the like diversity angle, which is great. But what we want to see and what we're fighting to see is that very specific LGBTQ funding that can allow our organizations to build capacity, which organizations like Kindspace, who again are doing crisis support when they are not equipped to, kind of building the opportunity to do that. Enchante Network, and I think this is a great resource for people to take a look at, especially if you're curious about the funding component for LGBTQ organizations. They recently released some research they did called Driving Transformational Change, a funder's guide to supporting 2SLGBTQIA+ organizations. And I'm glad I was able to help contribute to this piece of work, because I actually specifically focused on some of the issues we were facing when it came to how a department like the Department of Women and Gender Equality was defining which organizations were able to kind of utilize the fact that they do work for queer people or gender diverse people and who wasn't. So what we're seeing, and Jade kind of alluded to this before, is that GBV organizations that are able to kind of expand their mandate to include, say, women and gender diverse people, that they were able to apply for certain funding that the Department of Women and Gender Equality kind of had launched out as a part of their pandemic response. But LGBTQ organizations weren't able to access that funding because of some caveat of not having done enough women's related work. And that's really complicated for us to define, especially as organizations where women are, of course, people who would be accessing our service delivery. But what we felt when we were experiencing that, and I remember talking very closely with the folks at Enchante Network about it, was that it was a stark reminder that that is a structural issue that, funders are creating that prevents us from accessing funding that would have been crucial at a time during the pandemic when so many of the people we were servicing needed to have support. And so the funding issue is always going to be a tension. And I think what we're continuing to fight for, and organizations like Enchante Network are doing through some of their like public opinion campaign work, is to show that LGBTQ organizations are doing instrumental work in their communities. And part of that work is GBV related. And that there's not only a need for funders to catch up to be able to fund us, but there's also some conversations that need to happen cross-sectorally between LGBTQ organizations and GBV organizations about how do we build each other's capacity, recognizing some of these historical issues with regards to distrust, but then also recognizing that we all are fighting for the same thing, And that's a world free of discrimination where the communities we serve can thrive and live lives where they are not impacted by violence. And so much on the funding side that we can talk about, but this is just obviously a snapshot of what we talked about a little bit more in the editorial. And side note, if you ever want to talk about funding with me, I will gladly make myself available, because this is obviously a very, very interesting part of the work we're doing within the 2SLGBTQ sector.
Great, thanks, Debbie. And do you think it's time to kind of go into building the table? I feel that that's kind of a really good moment. I know the Learning Network is going to be sharing the slide deck, so we're just gonna let's just move there. And
actually, I would like to quickly address. Yeah, let's stick here. A few things that I think is important to address. Actually, if we can just go back one slide for a second, Marlene, just so we can, as we talk about building the table, it's really important to recognize sort of the tensions that exist in service delivery. And so particularly how our efforts to include, and specifically, we're going to use trans women and we're going to use shelters as sort of an anchoring point. This is also very personal to me, but also particularly in which how certain shelters will choose different sorts of ways of identification in order to include trans women. Sometimes this can look like, self-identification. Do you identify as a woman? Sure, go ahead. And they have the procedures and the plans to sort of deal with those things. While others might ask more invasive questions such as medical procedures, legal names, assigned sex at birth. And then some may not wish to include at all or may try to be avoidant. We know from Women's Shelters Canada in 2019 with their national survey found that the 47% of participating organizations were serving trans women, with the majority either disclosing not or are not known. And so we can move to the next slide. I think this is really important as we sort of frame not only service delivery, but how cultural tensions can fuse these structural binaries as well. And I think when we talk about this, we talked about second wave feminism, but we haven't sort of talked about the offshoot of that sort of prevents us from being able to work cross collaboratively, not only in our own organizations, but also at a very service user and client level in how cultural issues permeate. We just talked about how Bill C-16, how inclusion of trans women, has been attention. We look at Vancouver rape relief. We look at situations where you have sticky tensions that you may want to avoid in terms of discussion. So a prime example of this is I'm going to talk about how we talk about GBV and sex-based violence. There is often a false notion that trans women or gender diverse folks do not experience sex-based violence as a part of gender-based violence. This dichotomy is often brought in between separating the two, often used as we describe as trans exclusionary radical feminist, which is an offshoot of second wave feminism. I'm going to use the word TERF as a short representation of this. This understanding is often what prevents sort of this movement as this fear or erasure that women or women's service users, cis women, are going to lose access or be put in frightening situations due to the masculinization and transphobic sort of rhetoric towards trans women and a denying of their identities. And I want to talk quickly about as a survivor an experience that I had. This may be triggering. I just want to give a moment for people to mute. I'll touch my nose when I'm done. Okay. back in 2015, I dealt with an experience of violence in a public space. I was walking home after doing student conference work. I was a women's representative at the time for the Canadian Federation of Students, specifically working on a few issues. And I was coming home. It was Friday, and it was really late, around 11 o'clock, and I was attacked. At first I was berated and was followed and was like, you know, hey, sexy, hey, woman, experiencing all the same types of forms of gender-based violence as I was being read as a woman, and I am a trans woman. But at this particular time, I was being read as a cis woman. This person managed to catch up to me as I was running away and managed to pin me down and struggle with me. To the point where I got to the situation where my genitalia was exposed and the violence switched and the violence shifted very quickly. At the time, I not only in that moment outed as trans, but what seemed to be a sex-based violent attack then multiplied in many ways. And so the idea, and this was also mentioned in one of the questions around, you know, violence caused by men to women, this permeates to gender diverse folks, trans women, and is experienced as such. And so it is so important when we look or when we discuss these things and try to separate gender-based violence in terms of homophobia from transphobia by fully focusing on sex-based violence and saying that this is an experience that can only be felt by cis women, and that this is and by including trans and gender diverse folks into service delivery and into missions, that we shouldn't address it is a problem. And this can happen both at boardrooms, across tables, not wanting to make the wrong decisions, even in a positive way in regards to addressing trans and gender diverse folks. They may be like, I don't want to make the wrong decision. I don't want to get canceled. I don't want to have to, you know, what if our staff or our volunteers are unable to deal with that situation? Or what, in many cases, if a trans woman is being masculinized, what if a service user may have, who may be a cis woman, is in opposition and is actually now having to, you know, recognize and deal with, and they're having their own triggers, either from transphobia or misreading a trans woman or gender diverse person as a male. And so how do we navigate those sticky tensions is really important. And that begins with discussing them. We often not want to talk about them in fear of making wrong decisions, or in fear of hurting people, or in the fear of being transphobic or saying the wrong thing. I think as we talk about building the table and we talk about inclusion, it's important to recognize that you will make mistakes. These mistakes will happen. There will be conversations that will make you want to leave a boardroom, maybe take a cigarette break, you know, leave, need to come back. You know, as we talk about trying to mitigate this harm, if we don't address how to actually, you know, ensure that all service users in shelters or GBV are experiencing and are able to access resources, it includes collaborative work. I just want to quickly, briefly discuss the LGBTQ plus youth priorities in addressing gender-based violence. So this was a report done by Wisdom to Action, just underscoring how intimate partner violence, again, with this dichotomy and sort of within this this archetype, 2SLGBT folks are left out of that conversation, as well as within sort of our discourse, either it be trans women through sports or through media or through using washrooms, is constantly at a point of consumption, either through media, either through our bodies, in regards to both in shelters, both in trying to receive access to care, at every step of the way. Just under patriarchy, our bodies as well are being devoured and consumed. And so again, you know, it is so important as we discuss these things to recognize how gender-based violence and even this archetype does permeate and affect other gender diverse folks. We'll skip to now building the table. So we sort of build and situate this self off of Shirley Chisholm, who was an American politician. She was one of the first Black women elected into the United States Congress in New York's 12th District. She's an inspiration. One of her quotes, if they don't give you a seat, bring a folding chair, has been sort of a mantra in terms of how folks and other equity-seeking groups, disabled women, Black women, Indigenous women, Indigenous Two-Spirit and gender diverse folks have talked about, bringing your own chair to the table and getting a seat at the table. But if you're not able to sort of build it and retroactively imagine and be exploratory and creative in including Two-Spirit and gender diverse people from the start, both internally and also in terms of scrapping and building new tables, then it's not going to be as successful. And so it is more about, when we talk about building a table, it's about really taking this moment. We're coming off of, of this global pandemic where, we have seen sort of the increase of intimate partner violence, of traumatic brain injury, of 2SLGBT violence, racial violence, as all being morbidities in this pandemic. And as we sort of navigate these terrible 20s, how are we working together to sort of fill those gaps, both internally within your own organizations and sectors, but as well as how do we build together and support, take an equal stake in this work and act in good faith. We can move to the next slide. And so this begins with relationship building, which includes a inclusion so if, say, for example, existing structures, taking that, that non-binary lens and applying it through your survivors at your organization in terms of how you're approaching service delivery. And that includes situations where you might need to collaborate with 2SLGBT organizations. Say you're a rural environment, and you might have a different sort of community, and there is no sort of resources for 2SLGBT folks in your community. Then I think it is so important that taking those gaps and wanting to fill those gaps is reaching out to those in the area and other folks who may be interested in sort of doing that work. And that includes moving beyond sort of this one archetype and recognizing that their gender-based violence and nuance of gender-based violence is complicated, and that this doesn't dilute the archetype of again, male-based violence or being the perpetrator of violence. And so it is about directly addressing the narrative of inclusion that inherently, when we talk about scarcity and competing needs. And so it's really moving beyond that. As Debbie alluded to earlier, 2SLGBT organizations have had to be creative. And as well, GBV organizations having to fight, trying to keep their doors open. This is not new to us, recognizing that it is hard work to do this. Many of us are burnt out. But even during the pandemic, spaces like Crime Space, we're not not an emergency center, but we've had the loop around where we reference out and being like, this is a resource available for the service user, and then we get referenced back as a resource, even though we had just referenced out in terms of resources that are available, and that includes building networks and blueprints. And so it's really important when you are building your own table is looking at the blueprints. Are you building an Art Deco table? Are you building, an Art Nouveau? What is the purpose of the table? What is it looking like? How does it fit for your region? And so that includes existing your capacity limits. I know for most of you, you're probably like, we are at capacity. We have limited volunteers. We have limited staff. We're just trying to keep our doors open. But that shouldn't stop you from collaborating and from dreaming. This is a really big moment for us to dream about what could be. And it does not hurt to build blueprints. And this includes setting realistic priorities and commitments And adapting changes that are, that are logistically easy to implement, and also engaging communities and reaching out in order to how, either it be a local Black community or the local Indigenous Two-Spirit community as well, in terms of implementation such as, Reclaiming Power and Place the final report on the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. There are many recommendations that can be implemented without having to exist or navigate these tensions. And then there are harder things which might require needs assessments and community consultations, and expanding your already consultations to include trans folks. And that means meeting people where they are. If you're a shelter or a GBV organization that is trying to reach 2SLGBT communities or populations and saying, we are trying to either build or restructure our organization to accommodate, or we are already there, then it's important to reach out to 2SLGBT organizations that already have trust in the community in order to be brought into networks, be brought into sort of promoting and sort of, putting these needs assessments out where they need to go. If you haven't had experience in those communities, how are you expected to be able to bring those people in? And so you got to meet people where they're at and really trust that trying to provide services and trying to end gender-based violence doesn't need to be competitive in terms of needs, that we can be exploratory and we can be transformative in terms of how we visualize structures. And decolonizing, this looks like building whole new tables, whole new structures, whole new orgs, without having to, that can include that without having to erase, but also restructuring current organizations in ways that works for your community. And so it's important to analyze, consult, pull from frameworks and models and policies that exist in similar institutions and services. So this could include LGBT organizations. We've seen, it could be an art gallery, which may have a very good sexual assault policy that also addresses, 2SLGBT communities. It might be, things that you may have never thought apply to your sector, may actually apply and may actually be very, very helpful, and referencing sort of your new blueprint in terms of the type of table you want to build. As we move in sort of how we engage and build our policy and network through an intersectional lens, look at your organizational history. I can guarantee there has probably been issues on the ground or on a table level where other forms of gender-based violence like transphobia, homophobia, and misogyny are concurrent and exist. And, it is important to recognize that to take accountability for that. That doesn't mean being canceled. That doesn't mean, recognizing and taking responsibility either through participating or being complicit in colonization. Means taking accountability. And that doesn't mean you're going to be canceled, but it means taking that step and taking that risk in order to sort of address and sort of move forward. Because if you aren't able to deal with your baggage, then it's not going to work out. And also don't be ignorant of domestic and domestic geocultural tensions. Canada's a very, very, very big nation state. It's made up of over 200 First Nations and unceded territories across Turtle Island. And what's so important is that there are different historical communities, different ways of immigration, different cultures. We live in a multicultural society. And so the types of communities and the types of folks that may be in your specific, or it's going to look very, very different. And so the resources and the gaps that you may have are also going to be very, very different. And so it's important that you really, again, build through those relationship buildings with other folks who may be able to support that work, and making sure that this isn't, that you're not hesitating because you're afraid of what might happen, and being able to sort of live within and that includes, you know, dichotomous and binary traps of being like, if we let trans women in here, what's going to happen to cis women? If if we create a shelter or a wing that accommodates 2SLGBT folks, and you know, we include, you know, gender neutral washrooms, or we include private stalls and things to sort of mitigate these issues. What are you doing to sort of address those tensions and address those issues? There are solutions and ways that we can sort of tackle those tensions head on, specifically in service delivery, to really be inclusive. And yes, these things take money. Yes, these things take time, but we shouldn't stop and go for them because we're like, we're at a capacity. There's no point, you know, and really, and also allowing us to allow other folks to take a lead in, you know, and have a voice within the work. And so that looks internally, either through representation, but not just representation, but again, in building. And then assemble, you know, maintain, I'll go a little quicker, establish and maintain regional and local GBV networks. That includes missing partners that you may have, mandates, different demographics. And then also when you're assembling, update your infrastructure and your design and outreach, you know, with expanded missions and mandates to accommodate victims and diverse forms of gender-based violence. You know, many just stop at, you know, they're like, we support trans folks now, and we have this process, but it's not very well advertised. Trans folks don't know that they can access those resources, or that they can feel included, or that they can, you know, that they can, when they're escaping violence, that they can have resources. But this also looks like other forms of resources, as was mentioned. Kindspace has recreational resources, social resources, you know, community-based connections for folks who are able, who are able to sort of need other forms of care. And so at a point of care for a survivor, what are the different networks and resources from the moment that they receive care at a shelter, and as they're sort of transitioning from a violent situation, regardless of where that's from, what are the different resources, connections that they can access? And that really means, you know, beyond our current networks, reevaluating them and see who's missing, and also creating more networks, you know, and including more LGBT networks, Black women, Indigenous women organizations, Two-Spirit and gender diverse organizations, to be involved in that, and sort of to share that work, to share that equal stake as well. And that looks like services, networks, advocacy, and infrastructure. So in those 4 key points is important. We should advocate and participate in the development of a national standard, and advocate for one where there is none, and a set of recommendations to internally evaluate how your table and change is doing. You know, this is passive recommendations, suggestions. You know, we really should, if we're building the table, we really should say, what should a table have? You know, what ideally, how do we review how those tables are succeeding? How are we saying, you know, this is the best case in order for, you know, and many different orgs and regions may have different suggestions of what that looks like. But nationally, how do we look back and say it is now 2030? How have we done? How have we done in the last 10 years? What has changed? And how has that inclusion efforts? And also, what have been the challenges? What have been those sticky tensions? What is preventing us from moving forward? What, you know, and that includes ensuring that the table is able to sort of brace all the things that are on top of it. If you make a flimsy table and you put a bunch of books on it, it's gonna collapse. So you need to make sure you have many hands and many things to ensure that the table is built and that it can hold on, because without the table, you can't really have people to sit around it. And so, yeah, I'll finish before spreading to the rest of my colleagues here, is saying that, again, this does not, when we talk about building the table, many of you around are just like, well, this ain't new to me. I've been an activist. We've been talking about this since the 80s, or we've been talking about this at our own organization for a very long time. And we really believe that it is crucial now more than ever to break away from that fear and really be exploratory in terms of how we choose to work cross-sectorally, and in terms of how we decide how we're going to accommodate our missions. You know, it's not good enough to just say, you know, we're being inclusive. How are we actually doing it? And when we're struggling, when we can't do that, when we can't meet those needs, how are we able to bring in other people? How are we able to sort of collaborate in order to ensure that all folks who face against gender-based violence are included. And that does not mean erasing, violence that occurs between cis men and cis women. This does not mean, but this does mean recognizing those nuances and intersections that exist and that are very prevalent in terms of violence. And so, we mentioned in our editorial that you could have bread and butter, but we can also have jam. Or even peanut butter, and so why just stick with the bare bones when we really can really create when we come together and recognize, what our goals and collective missions are. So.
I'm going to just jump in here because I know a number of people have to leave at the 2:30 mark. So I'm just going to ask Jasmine to put the evaluation link in the chat box. And I also want to say thank you to Jody and to Marlene for providing or standing by in case there was a need for ASL interpretation services. But I also know that you need to move on at the 2:30 mark. For anybody who can stay, it would be wonderful if Debbie and Jade and Marlene can, to share a couple of your questions. And those who have to leave, you'll be able to hear it in the recording, their responses to some of your questions. So if that's okay, we'll move on to that area, knowing that some people will have to leave, but we would like to share a couple of questions. So I'm not seeing any hands up from our presenters saying, no, we can't do that. So with that, that's wonderful. We really, really appreciate that. And we'll just move into some of the questions. I think a lot of the questions were sort of covered in the last segment on building the table, but I'd still like to open it up a little bit to revisit a couple of those, but I wanted to start with one that was quite different than that. And one of the participants shared, I heard a really interesting alternative approach to feminism, which is to recognize that fundamentally this is about the marginalization and oppression of femininity. Do you think this approach could offer more opportunity to make visible and address gender-based violence against 2SLGBTQIA+ people? I wondered if you would start. I'm gonna read nonverbal cues, and I saw your head nodding. Debbie, can I call on you to start off that part of the discussion?
Yeah. The nodding was me definitely like taking in the kind of shifting of the framing of kind of violence attacking femininity. And I think the reason I like that, or what I'm leaning towards, is the fact that it addresses culture. It's certain cultures or how we develop certain norms in our societies that say what type of gender performances are worthier than others. And in a patriarchal Western society that operates within a gender binary, femininity has been undervalued through gender stratification. And we see how violence is used against femininity showing up. But then I was also thinking of the fact that violence is also used when it doesn't show up. And I mentioned corrective rape, and I specifically mentioned masculine of center or butch lesbian women. And that's because although our society says femininity is undervalued, for those who don't perform it but are still assigned female at birth, we still say that you have to perform femininity. And in you not doing so, you're also going to be corrected in your behavior through violence. And so I like the fact that that could be an entry point to us, of us looking at culture and at a way and kind of broadening who then is impacted by it. And I think that means everybody. Everybody, regardless of what you're assigned at birth, is taught femininity is undervalued within a patriarchal society like the one that we live in. And there's a great entry point there, but I wouldn't want it to leave out the fact that we also are told who has access to masculinity, and that also has violence addressing it at the same time. So these are just things I was thinking about, broadly speaking, that I think could open up a very interesting conversation. But yeah, I'd love to hear what my colleagues have to say about that.
Jade or Marlene?
Jade.
Yeah, sure. No, I definitely agree. I think this goes back to sort of the point around sort of just like how feminism or how violence is again viewed, and sort of, I mentioned the point earlier around sort of this dichotomous view in terms of, again, when we talk about sex and gender, but specifically around sex-based violence and gender-based violence. And so we sort of look at sort of this nuance without the nuance, or this dichotomous look in terms of how these forms of violence are experienced and who experiences those types of violence. And so I think, again, when we talk about feminism, a few years ago, it was during the Women's March in Halifax. It was very controversial because many of us Indigenous and Black women stood in solidarity with other gender diverse folks and marched and sort of made a statement after sort of having, the National Women's, the Women's March Halifax sort of not address transphobia that was taking place on the Facebook page and sort of two participants who were sort of being there. And so we sort of had to force this discussion on a public display about what does intersectional feminism look like? And again, sort of around, femininity, my experience of violence as a trans woman has both been the rejection of myself as a woman and this forced masculinization of my identity. And then also the impact that most of my violence has been occurred because I am a woman, because I am read as a woman. And so that experience, that femininity, my femininity is often a target to violence. And so, yes, I agree with that point that was raised. But I think, again, as Debbie mentioned, and as sort of we've mentioned, the impact of how violence is sort of how bodies and how identities are sort of consumed and read is very critical as we look at in terms of feminism and in terms of me. I don't find feminism an exclusive word or an exclusive term, and more so, again, who is included within that, and that violence again is related back to the patriarchy, which is an offshoot of colonialism, and sort of, that land is something that is meant to be conquered, that people and that women are meant to be conquered, that gender diverse folks are meant to be controlled, silenced, and marginalized. And so when we frame our discussions within that, and sort of that dichotomy that exists, and sort of those nuances, it's important to frame it that way. Sorry, Marlene, I don't know if you wanted to say anything.
I don't really know how I top that, Jade. And I think the piece for me is that construction of femininity really does go back to processes of colonization, of patriarchy, and also white supremacy. So I think all of those pieces are very much linked. So when I think of an alternative there to femininity, I mean, that is also a part of the discussion that I think we need to really have a better understanding of in order to make some of those shifts. Yeah.
Thank you. Jade, you mentioned that we're going to make mistakes and don't avoid or be silenced because of the fear of making mistakes as we build the table. But one of the questions that came in was, is there a point at which the GBV, VAW sector needs to take accountability for the harm it has caused to 2SLGBTQ plus survivors in the process of doing better and in the process of building trust? And I think we'd like to hear from all three of you on that one. Jade, do you want to start us off?
Absolutely. Again, I think the point, and this is sort of cheesy and, but we love cheese, is again, around sort of that homophobia and transphobia has sort of existed, and that that you're going to make mistakes, and that this fear that you might lose funding, or the fear that you might, you might piss off the wrong person, pardon my language, is really, really strong. And it's about how you're proceeding, how you're choosing to be accountable, who you choose to talk to and include, in terms of if you're worried about sort of how you're being perceived or your history, or how to take accountability processes in terms of your community, reach out to your local 2SLGBT org, reach out and be like, how can we do better? How can we, move forward in order to sort of address these issues? And I think, again, like, we have to call a spade a spade. We can't hide from conversations because we're afraid that it's only going, I find sometimes in the sector, we avoid talking about the, again, sort of just like, certain topics, because we think that it's going to counter or be used against sort of, our, for example, trans women, and talking about the experience of how a service user might view that trans woman in a completely harmful way while trying to access a service. That's gonna happen. That's gonna happen. It's gonna happen. It's gonna happen. And so how are you able to then address, you're like, if we're not able to deal with our own baggage, how are we going to sort of move forward and be able to feel sort of, I guess, the confidence to be able to do so? And that requires, again, that collaborative piece, but that piece to, again, recognize and be like, there may have, say you're a recent executive director for a shelter, and you arrived, in 2019, and you're sitting there and you're like, I don't know what violence has occurred. Well, that includes looking at historical knowledge, and trying to get that institutional knowledge, but it also means taking accountability in complicity. You may not be directly causing harm, but you may have been complicit. And how are you standing out from the rest and being like, no, we are making a decisive decision in order to, in our mandate, to include trans women and gender diverse folks into our mandate. And we're going to do anything we can in order to navigate that. And this is our steps that we are going to take. And it's being willing to, someone on Twitter is probably going to at you and may say, I don't, this is bothering me. And so if you're able to sort of prepare for that, again, focusing on those blueprints, Linda, to that person who asked that question, that is the phase where you really address those sticky tensions and talk about, how do we deal with this issue? How do we deal with this cultural issue? Because if you want to include, 2SLGBT folks in your mandate, you have to talk about it. If you ignore it, then you're then at the point of crisis at, the service delivery level, it's going to explode. And that might look worse than being able to sort of like be transparent from the beginning on how you're dealing with those situations and what your organization's stance is in terms of inclusion and in terms of, past histories and violence.
Debbie?
I was going to say, Jade did a fantastic job answering that, but I would just probably re-emphasize the point that there has to be some accountability, I think, from a sectoral level, and I mentioned it, right? That level of distress or that feeling of not being safe within the traditional GBV shelter, we're seeing it from the LGBTQ side. Both Jade and I working directly in those in that sector, we directly see it, and there's something to be said if we're going to be working on not only building the table, but I would say addressing our own capacity together. And so I feel like that should be something that people do. The complicity thing is real. And that's not just to say that GBV shelters are the only ones who've done harm to certain community members. Trust me, the 2SLGBTQ sector has a lot, it has to do with various folks within our own communities. And I think if we all realize that that is something that we need to do, especially at this point in history, I think then it's just one step to us getting to where we need to be.
And Marlene, I really want to turn it over to you, but I'm going to add one piece because there were a lot of questions. I should rephrase that. There were a number of questions that came in that really specifically spoke to their experience in shelter where there was violence against members of the 2SLGBTQ+ community, and just really wondering if there's any specific ideas or thoughts that you have, not just you, but all three of you, but going to turn to you first in terms of how do we begin in transformation and building this table that you're talking about? That's going to take some time. So in the meantime, how do we move to prevent and to do reparation for some of the harm that is occurring, and from the people that have been part of this resource spotlight are witnessing or experiencing directly?
Yeah, I mean, I guess from my perspective, Linda, and I think about some of the discussions that we had together around, particularly around building the table and identifying those structural tensions, because that's what was never being identified. Like we build around it. We offer seats. We look at inclusion in particular ways, but we're not actually addressing the tensions, so those structural tensions, but also the harms that have occurred. And I don't think you can do either without relationship building. And so we talk about that, the importance of relationship building, and the reality is it takes time. And this isn't something that is, going to change overnight. It's not as simple as, putting out apologies. It's not as simple as, identifying your wrongs, but it really is a much longer process to sort of, build that table, because it's like, we need to understand the tools. We need to understand the materials that are needed. We need to understand the people, the people who need to be there and provide that space for, those different experiences to actually inform what that transformation is going to be. It's kind of like someone could ask us a question today around, what should I do? And, lots of good information has been provided, and they go back to their organization and say, okay, this is what I'm going to do. But that would really be counter to what we are recommending. So it's not just about taking one piece of advice or one recommendation and go and implement it. This really is about organizations going back to their communities and building those relationships with 2SLGBTQ communities to create something together. That's building the table.
I'm just reading the nonverbals. Jade, did you want to just weigh in?
I think Marlene hit it home, but I want to sort of add by, again, with the sticky tensions, again, reiterating and addressing a messy thing. What I'm about to say is messy, but again, these sticky tensions, the mess exists where, again, there is rhetoric that trans women, using that as a framing tool, trans women accessing traditionally VAW shelters or GBV shelters are men trying to harm women. That is a discourse that is very, very prevalent. But we know that gender-based violence as well, outside of male perpetrated violence towards women and gender diverse folks, that in queer relationships, women can cause harm to women. How are you dealing with violence at the shelter itself? What is, if you're taking folks who are coming from violence and escaping violence, especially intimate partner violence, and you're having shared quarters or you're having different quarters, how is your policies and how are, this process takes a slow time, but also what is your violence policy looks like at cracking down violence that is occurring at a shelter? What is sort of the rules and mandates and sort of best practices that you have for all service users, cis or non or trans alike, to be able to access and know, what the shelter's resources. So it's also about being accountable to all users and all service users in that space about what to expect from that shelter and or organization general. I know we keep using shelters as a piece, but in terms of, what does that look like to actually address violence as it occurs? Because again, when we use that rhetoric, we forget that violence can occur in so many other ways outside of that archetype. And so, again, how are we, stepping away from that binary and dichotomous framing, and in terms of even how we view, again, violence at a service delivery level, let alone a board or a sort of a decision-making level. And what are we doing to sort of address violence and gender-based violence in its totality? And so I think that, again, that, as messy as that sort of is in terms of that framing tool, that's part of where that violence comes from, is from that tool. So how, are all those who are being put into an environment that could be hostile, that could have several triggers of different survivors, that conversation takes a long time, but being transparent to those who you're, to either to the 2SLGBT community and historically women who have access to shelters, how are you being able to sort of address those tensions and be honest, be accountable, and really sort of, build that dialogue and create, the safety mechanisms, because that has to happen. You can't offer a service without having safety mechanisms that address those nuances and those sticky gray areas that we choose to ignore.
One of the other questions that I'd really like you to respond to is about the importance of media and their role in how legislation will impact a community. And is there any plan to involve media or to include media in statistics gathering as you do research or as you recommend that research be done? Debbie?
Yeah, Marlene, I know you might have something to add on this with the femicide stuff because you folks been using media, but I wanted to talk about it broadly speaking from like a legislation change thing. I often like to say that the media is both a reflector and producer of culture at the same time. The role media has with regards to the 2SLGBTQ community, but I would also say in the archetype, right? Like the media helps inform what that archetype is and like driving the message that this is what violence looks like in our society. But then I would also say we've seen the media up until very recently continue to perpetuate this idea. And I think Jade just talked about it when we talk about the mess, these very problematic ideas of what trans women are or who trans women are. And that plays a role, I think, in broader society. And so we haven't even talked about, people who don't even use the services of the GBV shelter and what their opinions might be, because these people might be donors, these are stakeholders, and they might have something to say about organizations moving towards building a table with 2SLGBTQ organizations. And the media plays a role in informing what this group of people have to say. I'm bringing it back to my time working at a shelter. Some of our biggest donors were property owners. These were men. These were people who also play a role in violent stereotypes about our communities and how, if they hold the money, essentially, they can inform the decisions you make at your organizational level. And so the media is a very, very interesting and powerful tool. And I think from a national level, since that's kind of where my organization sits and informs the conversation that we're having, I think we need to be very creative in how we utilize the media collectively to kind of shift public opinion. If we saw how powerful the archetype was and continues to be in kind of shaping how we understand violence, how can we collectively, both in the GBV shelter and 2SLGBTQ shelter, work together to use the media in our own favor as we continue to build the table in our own way? So that's how I see it. The media plays a very, very interesting role, sometimes extremely harmful. But if you are skilled in equipping it for your own benefit, I think it can be a super powerful tool for informing change, for sure.
Thank you, Debbie. Marlene?
Yeah, I find this is a challenging one. I think that we have to be mindful that we're looking at gender identity and expression and sexual orientation when we're talking about the communities in which we belong to and that we're talking about today. And And when we put a focus on violence in relationships, it can easily become another reason for our deviance. And so I think we have to be mindful of that for sure in relation to media, because it, our communities often become problematized about what's wrong with us. And that is what we've had to really fight back on to gain legitimacy about who we are, what our bodies are like, who we're in relationships with, but also, a lot of what Jade's talked about is around how we also experience that violence. So I think we do have to be mindful of media portrayal. The other piece we've certainly seen, in terms of femicide, is that in my time of doing that work, in our organization doing that work, particularly over the past few years, very rarely are trans women identified, in a way that doesn't problematize them or doesn't attach them to some other social problem, when we compare that to how cisgender women in an intimate partner femicide might be portrayed. So I think there are definitely lots of issues as it relates to media portrayal and 2SLGBTQ communities in the context of GBV work, and what we would want to be able to, how would we use media in a good way? Yeah.
I want to bring us to a close by asking each of you to share what would be your wishes or hopes in terms of what people would take away. Because people are always, when they come to Resource Spotlights and they come to our webinars, they're always, what can I take away? Where do I go from here? And what would you wish that people who were part of today would take away from today? Debbie?
Okay. I think this is more of like a, take away from today. It's a wish, and I think we've been calling for it throughout the entire presentation. There is so much opportunity when we work together. And I don't want to do the thing where I'm placing the responsibility on the GBV shelter, but I'm going to do that. GBV sector. I do this kind of speaking about how power manifests and just recognizing the power that the GBV sector has in forming policy change. We've seen it. I've gotten to participate in many ways. I think that there is a benefit in meeting 2SLGBTQ people where they're at. And if you're in a community where there's a 2SLGBTQ organization or activists and advocates who are outspoken, definitely reach out and start that relationship building that Marlene mentioned earlier. It's not too late in the game. And it shouldn't be a shocker. And I just think, knowing how our community is, I think you reaching out will be well received. And I think you'd be really shocked to see what you folks would be able to co-create as, I would think, co-conspirators in this movement for liberation collectively. I really hope people today kind of take that lesson and really start digging and looking to see who's doing this work from queer and trans organizations and start building that relationship.
Jade?
Yeah, I want to build on that piece of collaboration and also recognizing, as Debbie mentioned, saying that we don't want to put on the onus on the GBV sector, but kind of do, is that this is also not coming from a place of saviorism, and that we have to sort of step away from that, and that this is a point of sort of expanding and moving beyond. And I say this term exploratory, and that is, we have nothing to lose when it comes to bridging ideas, reaching out, saying, let's have a coffee, let's talk about, proposals or things that we can sort of collaborate on. It is the inaction or the lack of saying it's too much work, too much capacity, I don't got it, and choosing. It's moving beyond that fear, I think, of making the wrong choice. And I think, again, when you partner with people, when you share that responsibility, that anxiety starts to dissipate. When we recognize that we're not competing for needs and that we can support one another in terms of not only strengthening the GBV sector, but again, like 2SLGBT organizations have our expertise within our own organizations and having to sort of take on some of the GBV work outside of shelters, but also sharing that knowledge. You have over 40 years of knowledge, of knowledge mobilization coming from the GBV sector that is so important as part of this work of inclusion and sort of, so how do we sort of not marry, but, mix these things together? How do we make the sandwich? How do we build the table is so important. And so again, recognizing that that saviorism doesn't happen when you're reaching out, and sort of being like, who am I bringing? And so it's, again, removing that competitiveness, I think, that existed, being like, oh, I gotta, we have this limited amount of funding and we have to take the funding out, advocate for the funding, sorry, not to take the funding out of it, at least let's collaborate on advocating, but more so, what can we do without the resources? What can we do together without all the things that we need? What are the ways that we can sort of navigate those things as we build capacity together, as we sort of do those things? And again, that's going to look different depending on where your location is, what community you're a part of, who is a part of your community. But again, I think, yeah, it's taking that risk. This is, let's try to make these terrible 20s. Let's think about in 2030 the amount of resources that we are able to create. So it's about that knowledge mobilization, turning it into action, and really, again, building those networks, reinforcing them, and being able to have that parking lot. You've probably been to so many panels where we have this massive long list of parking lot ideas, and then we have what we're working on, and it's those parking lot ideas that we're saying, this is what we want to accomplish, and we're going to stab at them. Oh, wrong term. We're going to work on them as much as we can. And so, yeah, don't shy away because you think it is saviorism. Step forward, take accountability, both in your own past, organization or, complicity, and let yourself free from those chains and really, think about, again, what does it mean to collaborate and really decolonize and sort of shake up the structures by, collaborating with folks who may have knowledge where yours is in gap. So, or where there are gaps. So I'll leave that with there.
Marlene, I mean, this, in some ways, this started with a very strong expression that you made in a meeting where the Learning Network was hosting, I believe. And so it's just so appropriate to come to you for your thoughts at this point, to add to your wonderful co-authors in terms of, and co-presenters today.
Well, I kind of go back to probably that initial thought, Linda, around, if this was an issue that was emerging today, what would we create? And I believe with all of the knowledge that we have, all the research that's been done, we don't need any more research, to kind of validate these experiences. With everything, that we know about our communities, I do believe we would create something different. But I think we have a lot of fear. And I think that, that's holding us back to creating something that we know, I think, underneath, we all know, is what is needed. So yeah, I mean, I would leave it with that. If this was an issue that was emerging now and today, what would we create and who would be at that table? and, what would those conversations be about? I think they'd be very different than perhaps they were 40 years ago, because we have different tools, we have different knowledge now. We have different communities, and so I think we need to create um, that is a reflection of those communities, and and we've learned, and so I think we need to go back and create, and to do something more. Yeah.
I just want to say, I think that today has been inspiring, and I want to thank all three of you for your work on the joint editorial. I want to encourage everybody to read the editorial, and when we post the recording of this webinar, we'll certainly have the link to the editorial. I also think we'll try to draw out of the resource some of the wonderful references, like the one you mentioned, Debbie, in terms of if we really want to understand history better, the wonderful recommendation that you made. I'm just blocking on the name right now, but we'll make sure that those are highlighted for people. Some of them we can't make available if they're a book, but certainly we can make sure people have the reference, and if they choose to go and get it from the library or to purchase it, they can do that. So I think that that's something that we can do moving away from today. And just want to express on behalf of all of the participants today and our team, a really big thank you to the three of you for leading us through this discussion. And with that, again, I'd like to just remind people to check the chat box for the evaluation. We really draw on your evaluations for planning future resource spotlights and other work that we do. So we appreciate the time you take, and we'll share those evaluations with our presenters today as well. So with that, I'm going to bring us to a close and thank everybody again for their participation.